Our first reading today is among the most bizarre and tragic readings of the Old Testament. So it's good to know a little bit about the context of where we are in the book of Judges. So the book of Judges starts out with what's actually going to be our first reading for this coming weekend of Joshua after Moses has passed away. Joshua has driven out a lot of the tribes around Israel, the Canaanites, and the various other tribes. And Joshua says to the people, you have a choice. You can either follow the God of Israel or not. And that sets the stage for what's going to happen in the book of Judges. Because the book of Judges is a downward spiral, one leader worse than the next. Judges were kind of like, not necessarily like a court person, but more like a tribal leader, military leader. So we hear in the book of Judges, things go from bad to worse. And the reason why they wanted to drive out these different tribes is that Israel wanted to make sure that they didn't have they weren't becoming morally corrupt like their neighbors around them and doing practices like child sacrifice. So they wanted to retain who they really were as God's chosen people. So what we have in this story that we hear today about Jephthah is things get from bad to worse. And so the leaders of Israel say, we need someone to protect us. So they call up this sort of like Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson hillbilly dude called Jephthah, who is a big buff guy, kind of like me. And I don't know why you're laughing. And he doesn't really know the God of Israel all that well. And so Jephthah makes this bizarre request, promise to God. He says, if you give me victory against these people that I'm going to go do battle with for Israel, I will make a promise with you, God, that whoever I greet on my way back from this battle, I will offer as a sacrifice to you. Weird, non-consensual human sacrifice, right? And so we hear that Jephthah goes off and battles for the leaders of Israel, comes back, and as he's returning to his home, who comes to greet him but his daughter? And he tells his daughter about this promise that he made to God. And the daughter honors Jephthah's request and goes off for a couple months to mourn. And he comes back and offers this vow to God and offers his daughter in sacrifice. What is this about? Well, here we have someone who doesn't really know the God of Israel, right? He's talking about God, but he doesn't really know who the God of Israel is. And he's reverting back to what the other people around him who are morally corrupt are doing. And I think he has a false idea of who God is. We see that also play out in our gospel today with the parable of the king who gives a great feast for his kingdom. And the people kill the king's messengers. Here's a king who is generous and loving, but they distort and twist who the king is. They don't understand the generosity and the love of the king. And I think this happens also in our lives of faith. We hear people often use the name of God, but in ways that don't really jive with who we believe God is. One really classic example of this that I hear often happens when someone tragically passes away. And people will say something like, oh, God must have needed another angel in heaven. Well, our God isn't one who, in order to make angels, looks down at the world and says, which of these humans can I pluck early from life from their loved ones? First of all, that's not how angels work. They're created beings like us, or just without bodies. And God isn't a God of vengeance who just like, well, I'll just pluck this person out of the world today. That's not who God is. But it's something that we can easily attribute. It's a false idea of who God is. And I think it's easy for us to hear people talk about God, but how do we really know who God is? What's one concrete way that we know who God is? What's what we profess every Sunday in the Creed? That is our great statement of who we believe God is, the Lord and giver of life. That's not the God that Jephthah is talking about in our first reading today. He's misunderstanding of who God is. But in the Creed, we find the true God, our true God, a God who loves us and who makes us for life. And so I invite you today to reflect on the Creed, to reflect on maybe a passage that stands out to you of who God is, and take some time to relish in the reality of who our God is for us.